Hi, I'm Dr. Peggy Henderson Murphy, and I am a media specialist here at Dublin City Schools. I've been teaching in public school for over 25 years, and the last 10 as a K 12 media specialist. I like to call my library a library media commons because for centuries, the idea of a library has connoted the idea of silent reading and study and kind of an isolation. But but we want our new spaces to be transformed into social spaces, spaces where people feel welcome to come and engage with each other and learn new skills. And I think for English language learners, that is particularly important in school libraries because we want them to feel welcome in those libraries and make them feel like that space is as much their space as any other students. And the way to do that is to transform our collections into collections that reflect our community and create maker spaces that also reflect our community and those we want to invite into our spaces. Since I want my library to reflect our entire school community, I always make sure that I have books in all of the students' first languages. That can be difficult because they're expensive. Sometimes they're hard to find. And if you're in a district like mine, you have students that speak a lot of different languages. But you can't imagine the smiles that you'll see on their faces, especially when in elementary school, when they walk in and see a shelf full of books that are in their language. The other reason I think it's really important, particularly as we go into middle school and high school libraries, is because students will often just focus on their English language learning and they will quit reading in their first language. And that is a real tragedy because their reading skills in that language will become stagnant and they'll realize at some point that they're still reading at whatever level it was that they quit reading in that language. And so it's one of my passions that I always encourage my students to not just focus on learning to read in English, but they need to continue to work on their reading skills in the other languages they speak as well. On the slide that you'll see in this presentation, I've put down several different places where I have purchased various language books. One of the places I get a lot of my books is at Goodwill and Half Price Books. Oftentimes, those are the type of books that students grow out of, and so their parents will just donate them. And obviously, especially at Goodwill, they're very inexpensive, and so it's a really nice place to kind of just keep your eye out all the time. Amazon has a lot of options, but they can be expensive. The other place that I actually got a ton of my books, especially in the beginning, was Book Drives. Again, these are books that people often grow out of, that kids grow out of. And so parents are pretty happy to have a place to send their books where they don't feel that they're just throwing them away, but they'll be used by other young people. Um, it's also important that the collection include books that the other young people are reading. And this really goes back to this idea of reading as a social construct. So for all students, it's really important that they're reading, that they have the opportunity to read books that their peers are reading. And so I'd like to make sure that there are really popular books on the shelf. Now, again, sometimes those can get pretty expensive. And so, for example, one that I always had was Harry Potter. And even now, that's still pretty popular for students who are English language learners to read those books because they might be reading them in their language, but they feel that they're reading something at their grade level and that they can talk to their peers about, and that their peers think is pretty cool that they're reading. Um, That's why there are so many book clubs because even as adults, we we like to be reading the same things as our peers. We like to be able to talk about them, and for that people to see what it is that we're reading. Which goes to the next one, which is about having multiple copies. So if we want them to be reading and we see reading as a social construct, then we need to have more than one copy so that people can read together. They can read at the same time, read the same books. And I have to say that in my experience, when I would, for example, have two or three of the same Harry Potter books, it was very popular for people who spoke English was not their first language, but they spoke the same first language to take those books and to read them together. The last resource that I want to mention that's on this slide is the International Children's Books. It's a website online that allows you to access hundreds of pretty classical children's ebooks in 13 different languages. So it is a really great resource. If you haven't checked that out, you really should. Here are some examples of different types of books that you can include in your library in order to enhance English language learners' interest, but also their skill. And one of the things that has often been suggested really is graphic novels. It's kind of a controversial issue. Some people really are advocates for graphic novels, and other people don't enjoy them as much. I think for English language learners, they are particularly useful. If you look at Krashen, one of the things that he talks about, and he's a real expert in the use of like comic books, and he talks about how the illustrations can really help students, EL learners, and also just struggling readers because they don't have to always understand all of the words, and they can still grab the concepts from the pictures, which does help them read and be more successful at reading. And they're also reading then things that are at grade level or close to grade level, or at least that their peers think are kind of cool, and they won't be made fun of for reading like children's or baby books. I did give you a link here to the article, so it's a good article about why graphic novels. The other option is high-low books, and I really love high-low books, high engagement, but they're lower level. I These are just general examples of books that lots of students like to read. They find interesting, but they're not very high leveled. Um, there's just hundreds of choices here though, and I also linked a couple of articles, one from School Library Journal and one from the American Library Association. And then Scholastic, if you don't know about the Branches series, it's a great series. It really is made for just young readers. Um, it helps with struggling readers, but a great option for EL students as well, because the stories are pretty good, but they're pretty low level reading. And then the last one is what I talked about before, about making sure that in your EL collections that you include popular series. So students want to be reading what their peers are reading. And so if they can't read them in English, then they should have the opportunity to read them in their first languages. The last thing I want to talk about is Makerspace for EL students specifically. It has become kind of a passion of mine, a real focus about creating makerspaces in library learning common spaces that are really interesting to all students. Um, but I particularly think about my EL students because what I have found is that makerspaces really allow students who do not have um, very high English proficiency to still interact with their peers on an equal level. And sometimes as the actual leader. And so by providing them materials that are culturally appropriate to them, um, they often find this ability to communicate with, to engage with their peers on in a kind of a leadership role. So, for example, in my makerspace, we have materials for rangoli. So that's the sand art that is often produced for different holidays. Lots of ink. So we have ink with the brushes. So appropriate types of ink for doing Chinese lettering or doing pen art. We also have ink for different kind of stamping that's appropriate for different cultures. Crochet has become a huge um, activity, I guess, in my learning space because there are so many different cultures that use crochet in different ways. So we've had French crochet, French doily crochet. My family happens to be Appalachian, and so I crochet because my aunts crocheted and my grandmother crocheted. Um, and I really learned at how many different types of cultures use hook fiber arts and just multiple different ways. But the materials you need for that are all pretty similar. Beadwork is the same. We have tons of beads because I find that different cultures use beads in different ways. The kids like to show, how they create jewelry or how they use them as decoration for clothing, that kinds of thing. So just a lot of different types of materials that many of my EL students enjoy using. They see them as part of their culture, and so it's very welcoming to them. And it, there's an element of cultural literacy, which I love because they're each sharing things about themselves and their own cultures with each other. So, the last thing here is that I ask you to ask yourself a question, and that is, am I taking advantage of and honoring the culture and social aspects of Makerspace? So, we have to think beyond Makerspace. It's just this opportunity to make things, and that it helps with problem solving because, anytime you make something, you have to think beyond and try to come up with solutions to issues or problems that you come against. Um, it's more than just collaborative. All those things are great, but it's more than that. It can be more than that. And I like to focus on the cultural literacy aspect and the social interaction and the way that it can help my EL students feel more connected to the community.